and everything, the gaming chairs were far better priced, etc., than the boring black ones, like a third of the price actually. So much to my son's envy, I've got a better gaming chair than him.
Chairs are a bit of a racket.
We can start. Check to the guys of the community.
Can you hear us? I heard somebody say, can you hear us?
Me?
Yeah.
Yes. Who? Oh, okay.
How are you, Craig? And how are you, Dominic?
How are you, Dominic?
Yeah, greetings. Well, and you guys?
Thanks, Craig. And Dominic? Nilesh, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Show your picture.
His webcam's on, it's just not displaying a picture.
Oh, okay.
No, it's not.
Guys, the webcam is on, but it's not displaying.
And there's an echoing sound.
Then Nilesh has turned his camera off now. You've turned it back on, but it's displaying a picture with a...
Come on.
Okay.
Are we live already?
You're using third-party camera software.
Possible.
On the Zoom link. So I'm not sure why it's not coming on.
You're on a Mac, do you need to give permission?
Are you using the web browser?
No, I'm on the app itself.
This echo.
If you're on a Mac, you might need to give it permission and then exit and come back in. That's been the bane of my life.
I think I'll have to come back in. Give me a sec or two.
What machine are you on nowadays, Dom? Mac or Windows?
Mac. Not a fan of the Macs that tend to just work, and I don't really have the time to recompile printer drivers every time I want to print something or something like that. No.
Printer drivers.
After about 9 years of using Mac, 3 different generations, I've moved on to a Windows computer, and I've moved on to a Samsung Android, just to get exposure to the other side. I must say, from a work point of view, Windows is definitely better from Outlook, different plugins that I use, like Calendly and Grammarly and all those things. You know, the native integration into Office is better, and no more dongles.
These guys are so
Yeah,
But otherwise,
I think we can go.
But one
We are live, right? Okay. Welcome to the Information and the Cybersecurity Center webinar, which is entitled Information and Cybersecurity in the New Normal. And my name as your host is Dr. Jabu Mtsweni. I am the head of the Research Center in the Defense and Security Cluster here at the CSIR. Thank you for joining us and for being part of this conversation. I am not here alone. I am with some of my friends, which I will introduce to you briefly. But before I do that, let me just do some housekeeping. Of course, today we are celebrating 75 years, actually not today per se, but this year is it's sort of the anniversary of the CSIR, 75 years in the making, doing scientific and industrial research. It's a big milestone. Of course, what we are talking about today may not necessarily, in our midst be 75, and I don't think any one of us who is here is 75. But the cybersecurity space is growing at a very, very fast pace, and there's a lot of things happening. Of course, I believe that every citizen's digital life, revolves around cybersecurity. Every business operations that deals with technology, they have some cybersecurity elements in it. The government's national agendas, they are also obviously focusing on cybersecurity. And there are many reasons for that. In this live webinar, we are going to be talking about the new normal, how things have changed, in the pandemic. And one thing, obviously, is that cybersecurity, mirrors mostly what happens in the real world. In the real world, as we see pandemics, as we see viruses, in the cyberspace, we also see that. I'm sure many people will remember the blaster, will remember WannaCry, and so on and so forth. So as we start, I want to just introduce some of my colleagues who are joining me today. But you can, obviously, as you are following us and listening to us, and thank you for joining, you can tweet using the hashtag CSIR75, or you can use the Twitter handle at CSIR, and some of my colleagues who are here, they have their Twitter handles as well. You can check them out at my Twitter handle at Jabu MTS, but also on the streaming that is on the website where we are live at now. You can leave your questions and you can leave your comments as well. We will be able to answer them as we go through this session. So the first person that I want to introduce to you, one of our old friends, Craig. Actually not Craig, but I think the first person I'm going to be introducing is Noxie. Dr. Noxie is joining me here on stage. She's one of our youngest research group leader at the CSIR, and she focuses on cybersecurity governance and also cybersecurity awareness. She is part of the SABS technical committee in terms of information security technical standards, and she's one of the winners of the aspiring 50 in South Africa, which was an award by the Netherlands government. So she's one of the young women who is growing in the cybersecurity industry, and one of the one who's going to be successful. So we welcome her, and then she will be sharing with us some of her insights. And then the next person, obviously, is Craig. I think Craig is one of our fathers here, but not that old. So Craig is the MD of Wolfpack, and I think Wolfpack has been around since 2011. Craig does a lot of work with small businesses, private and the public sector, particularly providing cybersecurity services to government. I always listen to Craig on radio. He has been on Metro FM. I don't know how he got there, but Power FM, as well as on SABC and NCA. Craig has a very strong foundation in cybersecurity, 20 years of management experience, and I think is one of the leaders in the country in the space, especially from Wolfpack. So with that, we want to welcome him as well. And then thank you, Craig, for joining us. One of our techies, technical guy who's joining us as well today. Many people may know him from SensePost, is Dominic White, who is he's got many positions, but today we will call him the ethical hacking director at Orange Cyber Defense, formerly known as SensePost. Many people would know that. He's got 16 years experience in the field. I think when he started doing his master's, he has been at SensePost for about 10 years. And he's more sort of the naughty guy who specializes in the offensive security, but he tweets as SINGE. I don't know how to pronounce it, but I think it's Singe, but he will tell us more about it. He's a guy I met for the first time in the US, but I probably won't remember that, at Black Hat. So he's one of the greatest guys we have today. And then one of our own, the next guy is Kweku Atta. So Kweku is one of our Chief Information Security Officer at the CSIR, and he has been transforming our security posture as an organization into a secure, sustainable state, which is very good. Prior to joining the CSIR, Kweku was doing some work in the banks, especially in the First Behavioral Bank. Many people would know about it. He holds a master's degree in computer science, and I think he studied, with a lot of people that we have, particularly at UP. He's a certified information cybersecurity specialist, and he will be sharing with us, particularly from the internal view, how the CSIR is doing and how we can learn from others. And then the last person I'm introducing to you today is Nilesh. Nilesh is the founder, Nilesh Jivraj is the founder of Real International Group South Africa. He has worked across the spectrum of cybersecurity with different entities, particularly in government. Currently, he supports a lot of entities in Africa, Middle East and Asia, and he works quite closely as well with what you call the law enforcement. Of course, we welcome all the panelists, and we hope that we are going to be having a great session. And I trust that as the panelists speak, they will be educating us, they will be creating awareness, they will be telling us how to protect ourselves as citizens. They will be telling us as well how to protect our businesses. They will be obviously teaching us some of their lessons, particularly in the new normal. So as I mentioned earlier, in the session, it's going to be a very interactive session, but before we get there, the colleagues are going to be giving us some of their opening remarks, and then as they give us their opening remarks, we will then be able to engage with them on what they have said. So as I've said, you can ask them the questions, at CSIR in terms of Twitter handle, or in the comments section, on the streaming side, or you can follow us as well. As I said, my Twitter handle is at Jabu MTS. So Craig, who is one of our MD, as I mentioned, is one of our MD from Wolfpack, and he has been doing a lot of this work. And Craig, I'm sure during this, what we call the pandemic, since the lockdown came in, we have seen a lot of things happening, obviously across the globe. So I want you to take us just through your opening remarks, telling us just a bit more about what is the cyber threat landscape looking like, in the new normal. What is it looking like? What are we seeing? And what are the root causes for some of these things that are happening that we are seeing? Just to break the ice. Craig?
Sure thing. So thank you, Jabu, for the invite, and congrats to the CSIR for 75 good years. Look, from our perspective, businesses and governments in general have been battling to stay up to date with the generic information security type of threats. And of course, now with the whole pandemic, the priority around remote working and information protection has been escalated and prioritized and pushed into the spotlight. Not to mention, we talk about the fourth industrial revolution and all these other things that are happening out there, which are creating such a dependency on technology. So I think we're at a point now where the landscape that most of us are trying to protect is just so vast, and companies are just falling so far behind in trying to understand, number one, what assets they've got, and number two, what are the threats that are out there, because this thing is moving incredibly quick. So a bit later, I'll break this down into 4 key themes from an international perspective, and then also from a South African perspective, where we see a lot of South African organizations, public, private, large, small. We do a lot of assessments in this space and work independently with organizations. I'm going to give you a sort of a lay of the land as what we are seeing as the key vulnerabilities in South African organizations. Where are they battling? Where, as a result of certain things not being in place, are incidents taking place? So with that teaser, I will leave it at that and come back and revisit it a bit just now. Thanks, Jim.
Cool. Thanks a lot, Craig. Now with Noxy, Craig has spoken about the various threats that are emerging, in the cyberspace, in the business environment, and also obviously in government as well. Based on your research, obviously, you are part of the CSIR. You may not be 75, but you are part of this great organization. In this new way of doing things, has the cybersecurity posture of organizations become better? Maybe because people are now working at home, they are not at work, so they are not bringing their flash disk, or has it become sort of worse? Take us through your opening remarks, Dr. Gaza.
Thank you, Dr. Thank you, Dr. Jabu. One would assume that things are better because people are working at home, but in actual fact, the security posture of organizations during COVID has changed. How effective organizations are in responding to these cyber attacks and vulnerabilities, the effectiveness thereof has decreased. So prior to COVID, things were not perfect. Organizations could respond 71% of the time. But now during COVID, research shows that the effectiveness has decreased by 38%, making the effectiveness now 41%. And there are many reasons that that is the case. And one of the reasons is that employees that are working remotely are using their own personal devices to log into critical networks and using critical business applications. So that has extended the cyber threat landscape a lot. And another reason for that is there's a lack of cybersecurity awareness, and of course that is not a new, it's not a new risk, but with COVID now, it has compounded the situation. You would see that with authentication, for example, we can see that since organizations are not really emphasizing the use of multi-factor authentication, that is also impacting the effectiveness of organizations to deal with cybersecurity in this pandemic. So things are not looking good.
Wow. So thanks, Dr. Gaza. Luckily, we have the CSIR Chief Information Security Officer here. So before we even talk about our neighbors, we need to just get an understanding on your opening remarks, Kweku. Within our environment, CSIR is 75 years old, so and I believe that probably we have seen more things than others. You know, what are we seeing? Especially you are, the Chief Information Security Officer. What do you see as some of the critical issues, that are happening, especially within the ICT environment? Kweku?
Okay. Thank you. The types of threats that we've been experiencing from our organizational perspective very much align with what my colleague has just opened up with. I think the threats really manifested based on the different stages that we went through as we started to engage in the remote working arrangements. So the first part of everything was really when the arrangement came about where authorization was given to employees to start removing their corporate assets and to start working remotely. So suddenly you had something that is completely outside of the norm. For the majority, the norm was to be in the office context, to be using your assets within the office context and not necessarily in a home setting. And you would have a number of end users not actually having the capabilities to work remotely. So we as the ICT function suddenly needed to enable certain capabilities, and quite rapidly so. So VPN capabilities, for instance, for people to make use of. The first threat that manifests there is really around, the asset loss, asset theft, and the byproduct of that being the information leakage and information loss and compromise. The next phase that we as the organization went through was really where when people started to settle into their new area of working, they started to consider how to return to productivity and really be able to continue as how they would normally work within their office context. However, as we all know, the actual climate and the overall environment was that of heightened awareness, heightened interest around the coronavirus, the whole pandemic. And we started to notice our user community logging on to webinars such as what we have now, logging on to conferences, signing on to all forms of different information sources online. And that's really where the second wave of issues started to come in. We started to notice that there were a lot of different campaigns around phishing. There were a lot of different campaigns around identity theft or information theft, personal information theft. And all of these were largely because of the environment of the pandemic. They were all COVID themed. So you can imagine how there was a lot of conversation around the vaccine for COVID, prevention of the pandemic, the actual causes of the pandemic, like 5G, for instance. And as you know, many governments who started to make relief funds available to the citizens needed to communicate these things to their communities. And ultimately, what we started to see is that this wave of phishing attempts started to advance into actual targeted phishing attempts. And in some instances, we started to see that our employees were being affected by, or rather weaknesses within our environment. Certain vulnerabilities were actually being exploited. And ultimately, what we started to try and do as an ICT function is to try and normalize our ways of working. So from an information security point of view, we started to work towards communicating awareness content that actually helped our end users to be more, behave more securely, whether they were in a remote or a private context, as well as within an office context. We started to accelerate some of our work in terms of hardening our systems and making sure that we can release our patching software in the environment. And in terms of functionality for business, some capabilities such as your electronic signatures, we now started to work towards that. So in the main, the threats have really largely been around, phishing campaigns, siphoning personal information from people in the organization.
Thank you, Kweku. You are indeed working for a research institution. You are very elaborative there. Dominic, welcome, and I hope you are doing very well. I know you came out of bed to just join us today. Thank you very much. As a technical guy, when I first met you, you were doing some Wi-Fi hacking stuff in Las Vegas. So you work a lot with these products, finding vulnerabilities. In your opening remarks, I just want you to take us through some of your thoughts, in the pandemic, and looking particularly at the technical side. What are we seeing? What observations are we seeing, particularly from the security products point of view? Dominic, over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Mtsweni. I appreciate the introduction. So I think one of the things that was very interesting is that our Security Research Center was tracking the number of vulnerabilities in all software. Charles van der Walt, some of you might know him, compiled this slide. And one of the very interesting things we noticed was that over the lockdown periods, when the lockdown started, you see a dramatic decrease in the overall number of vulnerabilities being released. And we can hypothesize why that is. We don't know for sure, but we imagine people are trying to deal with the lockdowns and don't necessarily have the time and availability and energy to deal with all of the vulnerabilities. However, if you then isolate that data to just look at vulnerabilities in remote access or security products, what you see is quite the opposite. So where the overall vulnerabilities have dropped by one of the largest drops that they have in months, the number of vulnerabilities in security products went up. And in particular, they were quite critical vulnerabilities. So we saw critical vulnerabilities in F5s, in Citrix, some Microsoft RDP, Pulse VPNs. And what that did is it meant that while people were shifting to this remote way of working, the tools that they were using to expose that securely were now presenting vulnerabilities. And attackers ended up taking quite rapid advantage of that. And we saw quite a lot of compromises of those technologies to deploy things like ransomware or to just engage in ransom-type tactics with data that had been stolen. The other thing I always like to caution on, though, is that there's two views of what's really going on. So on the one hand, there's the visible data. So we see ransomware attacks, we see people getting phished and losing money, and we see privacy breaches that have to be reported thanks to the POPI Act. However, the nature of crime and criminals is that you don't want to be caught. So you sort of have to ask yourself the question, did we see this because there was a consequence that came to light? So if somebody's ransomware publicly, a consequence comes to light publicly. However, if they pay the ransom quietly and recover, then you don't necessarily see it publicly. We see privacy breaches because POPI requires us to report them, and then they sort of get overrepresented, maybe for what they are. So there's always a duality I like to bear in mind of what's really going on is probably not what we're seeing publicly. And so those are the two things from a technical point of view that I found interesting for all of this. And then lastly, I think criminals also had to deal with lockdowns and kids at home. But the nature of cybercrime, or cyber attacks rather, is that they're remote already. So it doesn't require you to necessarily be as on site. So I think maybe they were better prepared than the rest of us to work from home. And they thrive on uncertainty, but whether we saw an increase in phishing attacks overall or just a switch to COVID-related themes, isn't particularly clear. I think the hypothesis is that people just switched. There wasn't a new wave. Thanks.
Thanks, Dominic. So as I mentioned earlier, so the cyber world always mirrors what happens in the real world. So I'm hearing Dominic talking about the second wave, and we probably don't have it yet in South Africa. Thank you for that. And Nilesh, unfortunately, your video, we could not see it, but I'm sure your voice is still golden. The people at home will still understand your thoughts. I know in South Africa over the past couple of years, last year in particular and this year, we've seen a lot of cyber attacks which are now relevant at home. Before, we would probably think that cyber attacks only happen in America or somewhere in Europe, but now we know that they are here at home. So Nilesh, maybe you can take us through just your opening remarks and thoughts and tell us what are sort of the attacks that we are seeing, and maybe give some specific examples, here in our country, in terms of maybe some organizations in the public domain, of course, that have faced some attacks, and maybe give us your thoughts on what is happening now. Over to you, Nilesh.
Thank you, Dr. Mtsweni. Thank you very much. Well, look, I mean, like the other colleagues have mentioned, that vulnerabilities are becoming more exposed and more exploited. And we've seen this over the years that, the cyber world has become more dangerous and has become more intrusive on people itself. But with these vulnerabilities, we also see that there's a huge change in the human behavior. And the factor that is most concerning is that it's not for the better, because the human factor itself is a vulnerability that can be exploited very easily, through crime syndicates and through just baiting the people with either some kind of reward or financial gain. It seems easy for you to actually go in and get an entry point into an organization. But the criminals are also changing their methods, like Dominic just mentioned. Their methods of their lines of business, that they do. So we see that ransomware and persistent cyber attacks are becoming more and more frequent in the region and in the country itself. But what's the worst part is that the dark web is not only polluted with data, but it's also polluted with service operators that are known as like your cyber mercenaries. Pay them some money and they'll be able to do the work for you. And this is becoming more dangerous tactics. It's becoming more easier to get those types of guys, and organizations out there are not really immune from these cyber attacks. We've seen different sectors, and if you can, that slide that I brought up on the types of events that have happened. Telkom being exposed on a cyber attack, Netcare, Life Healthcare, Nedbank, City of Johannesburg, which happened last year. These are all major cyber attacks in the country, and you can see that it's not limited to a particular sector. It's you've got the finance, you've got the healthcare, you've got the SOE environment that are being targeted, and it's non-ending. But what we're seeing also is that these attacks are mainly categorized in three kind of areas. You get the financial gain, so that would be attacks at the net banks and the Capitechs of the world. You get the economic or political type of attacks also, where activists are trying to make some kind of a point or trying to get some kind of a advantage over the government, over the neighboring government that they're working with. And the last one is either activism or hacktivism. These are people that are very strongly against political organizations. They have points to make, and they have very rigid kind of behavior patterns. You would have seen, for example, when Brazil won the FIFA World Cup, that a lot of the hacktivists who were coming out unsatisfied with them winning this thing, and they played major roles in some of the cyber attacks and some of the downtime that Brazil faced over that period. So for the last part of it, not all organizations are immune to cyber attacks. It's a matter of, am I attacked, or am I going to be attacked very soon? So from my side, I see that ransomware, persistent attacks, persistent cyber threats are becoming more frequent, and being used more effectively from the cyber criminal side of things?
Craig does a lot of work with the public sector, does a lot of work with the private sector as well. And Craig, you would know over the past couple of years, we have always spoken about South Africa and Africa, by the way, being the highest ranked, countries in terms of attacks and stuff like that. So Craig, just briefly, why do you think that is the case? What are some of maybe the mistakes that we are making as a country, not just government only, but both private and the public sector when it comes to the cybersecurity posture? Craig?
So once again, Dominic and Nilesh touched on the different motivations behind the attacks, whether it's organized crime or, government extracting intellectual property from other governments or other organizations. So I think in terms of the large-scale syndicates targeting, the richer countries or the more developed countries in North America, Europe, etc. Obviously, there's much bigger bags of money to be taken, but there's also much more repercussions. I mean, these countries have much more advanced detective and responsive capabilities, especially when it comes to law enforcement. So the risks are far higher. And for me, I think, the actual response capabilities and strategic bodies not yet being properly enabled or enacted in countries like South Africa and other countries or other developing countries is going to become a major catalyst for these guys to start targeting us. So I think that for me is at the top of the list. In South Africa, we've got pretty good capability in a number of the large, higher profile organizations. They are beefing up their security. They've got large teams in place, quite highly skilled, but it's pretty much fragmented. And we really, as a country, I believe, are still to this day very, very exposed. We see a lot of attacks happening, which are not public knowledge. Some we are involved in, others we hear through colleagues in the industry. And, also what we've seen is a swing towards attacking smaller organizations, especially NGOs. I don't know why, but we've seen quite a few attacks against very small non-profit organizations that really can't afford to lose 250 up to 1 million rands worth of funds. I mean, this is actually going to end up closing these guys down. And of course, schools and small law, sort of niche law firms, etc., being targeted. And also a lot of individuals getting hit and not having any sort of recourse. They go and report to the police station and not really having anywhere to go. So we've been generating of the individuals and the small companies that we've helped as well. We've been generating some interesting stats around, which I can talk a bit about later, what sort of crimes are actually happening quite prevalently here in South Africa, and trying to analyze that and see, what are the root causes of that happening and what as a country can we do better to help better service those that are vulnerable. So I think it's a collective of, we've, maybe just to summarize, we've got pretty good laws in place that now need to be operationalized. We've got POPIA, which thank goodness is going to be, partially switched on from July next year. We've got the cybersecurity bill, a very well worded document, and the, also the, I've forgotten the police one, which in essence provides structures that need to be in place to support the law enforcement and also prosecution efforts as well. Once these are properly enabled, once they are properly resourced, and ditto for the rest of Africa as well, then we're going to be in a far better position to respond and ultimately deter criminals from targeting our hood, so to say.
Maybe just latch on what you were saying, but go to just Dominic quickly. Dominic, you work on the ground, quite often, working with these companies, and I was very fascinated when Craig was talking about NGOs, schools, organizations that somebody may think they are not so targets. But as I normally give an example, Criminals, they don't care whether you have money or not. They are always looking after every target where they can get data or something like that. So Dominic, as businesses are adopting, obviously now, digital technologies at a faster pace than before, I think technology is sort of intertwined into our lives now, and you do a lot of assessments, assisting a lot of them. What are some of the common, if I can call them, schoolboy mistakes that organizations are committing that makes them sort of like susceptible or vulnerable to these emerging cyber attacks? Dominic?
Thank you. So the one interesting thing we noticed when people went into lockdown is we thought we'd be quite busy checking everybody's remote access setup. Because what you saw is people were making fairly dramatic changes to how their VPNs worked, how remote access was working in their organizations. They were figuring out new ways of exposing internal systems to the internet. But they didn't want us to touch it, and understandably so. This was now critical infrastructure. If this went down, people couldn't work. So you ended up with this problematic situation where people had made significant changes in a rush and weren't able to check that it wasn't exposing them to new vulnerabilities. So the one thing is to actually make sure that you've put some time aside, whether it's retroactively or before you're going to make these changes in future, to do some second level of protection to make sure that you aren't exposing these things in a dangerous way, or that there isn't some interplay between the way you're exposing something and other things you do within your organization. And I think the second thing is to examine how your architecture is impacted by remote access. So I mentioned the example of these remote access vulnerabilities in products. And I think a lot of the time what happened was a single vulnerability effectively exposed an organization. And if you can architect your perimeter, at least, in such a way that a single vulnerability isn't the end of your organization's perimeter security, then you're doing quite well. That's not an easy thing to do, but it's certainly something worth thinking about, whether it's additional detective controls or some other kind of smart architecture to make sure that there's additional gates or additional levels. I think that can differentiate you quite a lot from the others. And then I just lastly encourage people to use their threat model and their common sense somewhat to think about what are the most relevant vulnerabilities to them. It was great hearing what Kweku was saying that they were focusing on, because they clearly thought about what was relevant to the organization. But for example, I think a lot of people spent a lot of time trying to ban Zoom calls across their organization because these bombastic articles came out in the news about Zoom vulnerabilities. But realistically, that wasn't the predominant threat model that most people needed to worry about at the time. So a little bit of common sense thinking can also help. That would be my advice.
So thank you, Dominic. I just want to go to Dr. Gaza now, especially Craig spoke about some of the problems that we have in terms of the cyber attacks and the mistakes that we make. Now, as the CSIR, 75 years old, before you were born, what is the CSIR doing, particularly as a research institution of government, trying to push the mandate of bettering the lives of the Republic? What is the CSIR doing in terms of assisting government, creating a capable state so that businesses, citizens, and of course government can be able to address some of these challenges that Dominic and Craig spoke about? Some ideas there. You don't have to talk too much, but you can just give us a brief highlight. 75 years is long, so you can give us a 75-year answer. But for now, 2 minutes or so.
Thank you, Dr. J. I think perhaps I should start off by saying happy birthday, Team CSIR, and perhaps to answer this question, it would be fitting to first look back and think of what we've done before we can actually say what are we doing now. So I think because cybersecurity in itself hasn't been around for 75 years, around late 1990s, CSIR was already under the umbrella of information warfare. But I don't want to start an academic debate, with the difference of cyber warfare and cybersecurity.
100%. That's
However,
another day.
we were already working with military in terms of trying to assist military in securing their systems around 2002, we were already doing research on internet simulation. And I think that kind of research became the foundation of a capability that we have right now for network simulation and emulation laboratory. That all started with the work that we did in the past. Around 2012, CSIR contributed immensely in the establishment of the National Cybersecurity Policy Framework. And since then, I think we've been working very closely with government, trying to implement some of the directives that were set out in the NCPF, and that is to show our commitment in creating a capable state. So to now, we have the Information and Cybersecurity Center, which I'm proud of. I'm a research group leader there, working with governance, privacy, and trust. So what we are doing in the center essentially is we've underpinned our capability with the NIST framework. So we are fostering capability to detect cybersecurity threats, and we have technologies in that sort, like the early detection, early warning detection system that we are maturing as we go. We have capability in monitoring, where we capacitate a security operations center to support government departments. We have governance, as I mentioned, which is a capability that underpins all the NIST capability pillars that I mentioned. So we're doing quite a lot, and I think the center in and of itself exists to demonstrate CSIR's commitment in creating that capable state. One of our strategic objectives is basically solving for some of the issues that our colleagues mentioned, like the fact that we have our technologies in South Africa are not really homegrown. So we exist to solve for those problems. Like the fact that currently our landscape in cybersecurity is we are working in silos. We exist to be that kind of platform where we bring together different stakeholders from academia, from industry, bringing them together so that we can offer services to South Africa that will be solving for our cybersecurity challenges as we speak.
Thank you very much, Noxie. I think this panel, everyone is full of words and our time is running out. So let me go to Nilesh. Nilesh, before I go to Kweku, I just want to ask you, of course we are in the pandemic, the health sector I think is one of the areas where, especially in the States, we are seeing a rise, for example, in ransomware and so on and so forth. Just briefly, Nilesh, how, as an expert, somebody who has been working in Africa, in Asia and so on and so forth, how do we assist organizations to prepare themselves better so that they can, protect themselves against ransomware and some of those attacks that could be devastating, particularly if you could focus in the health sector? Nilesh?
Okay, sure. Thanks, Jabu, again. Correct. Ransomware has played a huge amount of havoc for different sectors in South Africa and in Africa for that matter. And where we see things going wrong particularly is where people within the organization, the staff, the employees, are not well educated with cyber awareness programs. And these programs are not effectively rolled out within the company itself. So, what might look like a legitimate information that's coming from a legitimate source may not always be legitimate, because you've got the what we term the man in the middle type of attacks, where people are attacking from and making it look as though the sender is legitimate, and emails are becoming the major sort of intrusive area for these ransomware attacks. Now, what I see more particularly is that organizations need to have a well-defined cyber awareness strategy in place that allows the organization to actually see where things are going wrong, what sort of things are going wrong within that environment, and particularly that within that cyber awareness program, that you've got defined technologies that are protecting key environments of your data sets that you don't want exposed. So as part of this, and if we look particularly around the health environment, I showed the picture earlier on where life healthcare was compromised, and with that kind of information, mine and your type of personal information coming out into the open, it leaves us as people also quite vulnerable to how our data is used and what can be done with that data. So from that aspect, the internal side of the organization needs to be more well equipped with a cyber awareness program that's implemented properly, that teaches exactly how the user itself needs to defend and needs to be able to have that defensive capability, what to recognize in that ransomware attack, and how to stop it from going any further in the environment. So for me, looking at any sector, whether it be health, whether it be the private sector, a properly defined environment for cyber awareness and defensive makes the person more defensive in their behavior, in their patterns, and in their day-to-day activities.
Kweku, just a briefly, because we have some questions online that I want to take before we close. CSIR, obviously, I was reading a Forrester study that says yesterday's solutions won't solve tomorrow's security problems. And, in this panel, we have the private sector, we've got the public sector, and obviously maybe civil society as well. What are the maybe your new thinking in terms of the new initiatives that we should have collaborating together, the public sector and the private sector, in order to ensure that South Africa and obviously the CSIR ultimately is well prepared to protect ourselves from cyber attacks?
Okay, thank you. It's not a easy question or an easy task to fulfill, but I think some of the things that we need to start thinking about or developing in is actually to build up the correct structures within our learning environments to actually build the right capacity. So if you look at our information security space, you find that a lot of our entrants are not exposed to information security at a high school level, or even in some cases, even at a first degree level. It's only at a postgraduate level. And I believe one of the things we have to do is to really start exposing people to the fundamentals of information security and create the right structures, be it academies or whatever other capabilities, so that we can actually give them the right foundations to support us going forward. I think some of the other developments, if you look at areas such as artificial intelligence or machine learning, where we can actually start to exploit analysis and try and make our security capabilities more agile in their effectiveness. So as opposed to having pre-configured security controls, we can have something that is much more dynamic going forward. So I think that's some of the things that we need to consider.
Thank you very much for that and being very brief. Let me go to Dominic and then I'll go to Craig as we close. Dominic, just, I've always wanted to ask you this. They normally say, some other people will say hacking is bad, right? But as we close this, why do you think companies need to take hacking seriously as also maybe a defense mechanism?
Well, I think there's just so many different things to focus on in the world of cybersecurity. So you can bring some clarity by thinking like an attacker and narrowing down what those possibilities are. If you think through an attack scenario, if somebody's going after something specifically critical to your organization, be that money or information, and you think about how your organization is structured and how somebody might go after it, well, then you can bring some clarity of thought to your defenses. If you take that one step further and then actually get ethical hackers to emulate those attacks, well, then you can find vulnerabilities along the way and you can close them. But possibly more importantly, you can bring your defensive teams along into that exercise and use it as a capability development exercise around detection and response. So I think the advantage of ethical hacking is that it can bring some clarity and facts into an otherwise murky world of hypotheticals.
Great stuff. And then, Craig, as we're about to close, we have about 2 or so minutes. We've got some questions online, but I wanted you, Craig, to just comment on this because I think it's very close to us as the CSIR, but I think as a country as well as we go through the economic recovery. Craig, I just wanted you to explain to us just briefly the aspect of how do we build the SMME, industry, particularly in the cybersecurity space, and then of course you can talk about the information risk framework, particularly for the companies. Over to you, Craig.
Yeah, I think the small sector of businesses largely overlooked or have been so busy obviously trying to grow their business that they've been focusing on marketing, sales, delivering on the promise and then collecting the money, that they don't realize the importance of cybersecurity, that it's not just big companies, any company size, even an individual is at risk. We've actually brought out a community site called alertafrica.com. Community is very much in my blood over the years, and there we've provided quite a bit of free resources for awareness, also a pro bono service to help victims of cybercrime, etc., and also a community to bring buyers and sellers together. So we're hoping that's going to be a good thing for the community, typically the small to mid-sized companies to latch onto, and really will help them. I think just to end off on my side there, Jabu, I just wanted to, and I presume you can see the information risk framework on your screen, just yes. To what the various speakers have touched on. So when we get pulled into an organization, either to help with an incident or where it's an independent assessment. So this is typically the dashboard that a security officer would have, on the top of their mind at all times, the governance elements, and then of course the operational side, the preventative, detective, responsive, and obviously measurement controls. But just to highlight some things quickly that I found very interesting in South Africa especially. The ones in black are as a direct result of these not being enforced or being weak or immature in an organization has resulted in incidents. So typically the culture of management or of typically the IT staff, if I can use that as a generic, not really taking security seriously and not being aware. So that was some of the points raised earlier. And then of course, the lack of policy and standardization in an organization also has been a direct root cause. Not knowing what assets you've got in place. Oftentimes when we go into work with the company, there's very outdated IT or network diagrams, not really knowing what they've got. So how can you really protect that? And one of the biggest challenges we see is, we come in just about every single incident that we've been involved in, they don't have proper log management in place. So there's logs being generated, but they're not monitoring the logs. They're not maintaining proper, time periods to manage monitor what is going on as well. And I mean, endpoint security as well. The biggest attacks we've seen coming in is through phishing, and obviously from a ransomware point of view, that's endpoint devices not being patched or up to date. So I can speak a lot on all these different areas, and they're all tied together very, very well. But yeah, at the end of the day, cybersecurity is not a simple thing to manage. It's a complicated environment that needs to be owned, not just by security or by IT teams, but by the whole business, because it impacts the whole business and it impacts the country as a whole. So thank you. I'm going to stop there.
Thank you, Craig, for those close remarks. So let me just now go through, as our time is already up. They are going to kill me. So let me just run through. Nilesh, maybe one of your parting shots, if you had to give a business, a citizen, government some advice, what would it be in terms of ensuring that we are protected in this new normal? Nilesh?
So for me, I think, Craig was talking about some very critical stuff, and so was Dominic. And I think that, we need to find, as business or community, we need to find a starting point of where we want to start our protection mechanisms, as they call it. But like Craig said, it's not something that's individual. It's owned by the company because cybersecurity affects everyone. So for me, it's be savvy, be secured, and start somewhere to do something so that you are showing a route forward into protection.
Thanks a lot. Noxie, there's a question here, briefly again, guys. Our time is up. They are asking, is the CSIR using some of its cyberspace research capabilities to inform public policy? I think you did touch on it, but just briefly.
Yes, the answer to the question is yes, and one of those is the NCPF. We also contributed indirectly to the cybercrime bill, but we do it extensively. But then, yeah, let me stop.
And your last tip, your best last tip.
My best last tip would be to make cybersecurity more of a culture than a compliance endeavor. So to integrate like cybersecurity beliefs and practices in the way that we do things around here. I think that could help, particularly with now the workforce working from home. So that would be my parting
shot. And then there's another question here. They're asking, are we ready as a country? Kweku, do you want to, a yes or no? We can explain on social media. Are we ready as a country?
Yes.
Yes, thank you. Craig, there was a question for you here. People were asking, you were talking about small organizations are under threat. Give us one thing that small businesses should focus on. Only one in order to be secure. I know you can give 20, but one before we close. Craig?
Sure. I think if I had to pick one, it would be skills. We as individuals, as parents, and as small business owners need to become a lot more cyber savvy. We have to help protect our children, to help protect our businesses. So you're going to have to invest in time and skills to do it. And I'll only encourage one last thing as well for the CSIR. A few years ago, there was an initiative launched to bring all the public and private sector research companies, academia together, and I was very excited, but nothing further happened. I think we really need to look at revitalizing that and getting behind, because research also is at the core of what we need to do. And as the private sector, I can promise you we'll be there to support you and really encourage that to take place.
Thank you very much. This is the start, so we are really going to be doing this more. I thank Zoom for bringing us together. So colleagues, I think we have to end it here. Our time is already up, but thank you for the questions that we have received. Those we have not answered, it's not because we don't like your question, just time ran out. I want to thank my panelists, Dominic, thank you very much. I know you came out of the woods to be here. You look very great. Craig, thank you very much. Nilesh, unfortunately we could not see you, but we really appreciate your partnership and your friendship with the CSIR. Kweku and Noxie, you are here, with me. So after this, guys, you would miss out. We are going to have our lunch and our tea and coffee. But above that, I want to thank the people who have supported us, who have attended this session. It will be available as a recording as well. And let's have more of this as we try to capacitate the country, make our government a capable state, private sector, the small businesses, and the citizens as well. With that, I want to say thank you very much and cheers.
Cheers. Thanks, Jabu.
Thank you.
Are we done?